One of the most important things you can do for your health is to control your blood sugars. And one of the most powerful tools we have to do just that is exercise. In this episode, we're going to dive a little deeper on how you can use exercise as a way to manage your blood sugars for the better. Let's get started. So welcome back, everybody, to episode 4 of the 5th season of the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Rennicke. Thanks so much. I'm a board-certified physician in family and sports medicine, and my goal here is to help keep you active and healthy for life through actionable, evidence-informed education. Let's get started here. So first things first, you might be asking, like, well, Jordan, why does this matter at all? Why do I care about blood sugar? I've heard about it kind of before. It doesn't matter. Well, it's super important. If you go back to my Necessary 9, kind of the first season, it's really one of the pillars of overall health, and there's a lot of importance placed on blood sugar control. First things first, about 10% of the US adults have type 2 diabetes. So that's just 10%. And about 45% of them have diabetes. So on top of that, we're about 50% of people, but more than half the population have some sort of issue with their blood sugars. That is not normal. That is not ideal. So more than half people have some issue with their blood sugars. That's why we should care so much, because it is so prevalent. On top of that, we think of insulin resistance as kind of the core of diabetes. So when your body makes insulin from the pancreas, usually you get some glucose in the system, right? You eat something and you bring in some sugar. Your body secretes insulin from the pancreas to then help absorb that glucose. However, with insulin resistance, your body needs to make more and more of that insulin to get the same amount of glucose absorbed until it reaches kind of a tipping point, which we call diabetes. So what that means is, hey, normally let's say you have an apple. Let's just say you have an apple, and normally it takes 10 units of insulin to do that. That's not normal. Like 10 units of insulin is a measurement. Don't worry about the numbers. I'm just giving an example here. But let's say you have an apple, and it normally takes 10 units of insulin to absorb that. Then with insulin resistance, what happens is you eat that apple, and all of a sudden you're requiring 20 units of insulin. So you can still do it. You still respond to insulin, but you're becoming more and more resistant to it, meaning it's taking more and more together until eventually you get to the point where you need more and more and more than we make the diagnosis of diabetes. So what your body's doing, though, is it's letting glucose hang around longer in the blood for not a real good reason other than we're sensitive or not sensitive to insulin anymore. And so we have too much glucose hanging around in the blood, and when we do that, it can lead to a whole bunch of problems. And the question you might ask is, okay, well, if this is a problem of insulin resistance, what leads to insulin resistance? And that's actually a great question. There are multiple different things we think may be contributing to that. One that we know for certain is excess adiposity in specific places, meaning, hey, if you have excess adipose tissue, that can lead to insulin resistance. And on top of that, having a surplus of calories, right? So when we have a surplus of calories, that leads to that accumulation of adipose tissue. And then when we get adipose tissue into surrounding organs like liver or the pancreas or the muscle, that can bring on insulin resistance. And this really does matter because with diabetes, you start to have issues with sugar all over the place, right? When you have too much sugar hanging around, it can lead to hardening of our small blood vessels that are found in the kidney, in the heart, in the eyes, and pretty much everywhere in the body. And so the things we think about, diabetes is one of the leading risk factors for blindness, for kidney failure, and has a direct correlation with heart attacks in terms of cardiovascular health. So there's only a few that I've named. It really impacts every single type of system, but it has a big, big impact. So we care so much about this. And so the question we have is, well, how does exercise and insulin resistance work? Like, what's the mechanism there? Does exercise help? Yeah, it does. First of all, exercise in and of itself can help increase pancreatic function. So when you exercise, you might just say, hey, I'm able to secrete insulin a little more, make it a little easier. So exercise in and of itself can increase pancreatic function. On top of that, then, it also does stimulate glucose uptake. So we've talked about pancreatic function and then glucose intake, meaning, hey, on the skeletal muscles, when you're exercising, what that does is essentially sends a signal in the skeletal muscle saying, hey, let's absorb the sugar. We need it. We're exercising. We need to do that. So when we're exercising, we increase our sugar without insulin. So they call it insulin independent uptake. So, normally, just to step back here, insulin dependent means, hey, when we release insulin, it binds like a kind of a key on the cells and say, hey, let's bring in that sugar. It brings in the sugar. When we're exercising, though, skeletal muscle says, hey, I don't need insulin. I'm just going to bring in sugar. And so exercise does help bring in that the sugar without needing necessarily any insulin. And so it's like insulin independent versus insulin dependent. That's kind of how it works. And getting into the nerdy of it, essentially what happens is when we exercise, a transporter called GLUT4 goes to the cell membrane of that and then increases glucose uptake. And this usually lasts about 3 hours. So when you exercise, you get about 3 hours of that increased glucose sensitivity without needing any additional insulin. So like I said, exercise can help from increasing pancreatic function, but also increases by increasing GLUT4 and increasing insulin independent uptake can be very helpful there. And then overall, though, your body's just more sensitive to insulin after exercise. It can be actually up to about 48 hours, specifically in the muscles, 3 hours, but overall in your body can be increased sensitivity for up to 48 hours of exercise. Also on top of this, we may have things where, hey, you may be decreasing body fat, increasing lipolysis, improving vascular function, all these different things. So there's multiple different mechanisms for how exercise can help your glucose tolerance. If we step back, it can be insulin directly related, meaning, hey, it is helping your sensitivity to insulin. It can be insulin independent, meaning your muscles taking up more. And then there's other things as well that just kind of ancillary benefits as well. So lots of good things. Exercise is very good for insulin resistance. If we're going over to preventing diabetes with exercise, how do we do it? Well, first of all, the big tool that we use it for is it's used as a tool to maintain a healthy body weight. So when we're exercising, if you are a normal body weight, exercise is usually probably a big part of that. So that's a big thing. However, though, if you are at high risk, say of prediabetes, exercise is then used as a part of a weight loss plan, which can then return you back to a normal insulin level in terms of insulin sensitivity level. So number one, using as a tool to maintain a healthy body weight. If you're already healthy, cool, exercise is great. Two, if you are elevated and maybe have increased adiposity, exercise can help decrease weight, and that may help get rid of, say, hey, from a pre-diabetes standpoint into a normal insulin sensitivity type of issue. And even a 5 kilogram or 5% weight loss can lower the incidence of diabetes by about 40 to 50%. So it's a huge difference. If you just do a little bit, that goes a long way. They've even found that physical activity independent of weight loss, right? So independent of weight loss is an independent predictor of the prevention of type 2 diabetes. So one study showed that even as little as 2 weeks of high intensity or even moderate continuous exercise was able to reverse pre-diabetes in 40% of participants. So that's pretty crazy. Let's look at that for 1 second. This is obviously one study is looking at that, but these people exercised for 2 weeks. Presumably they were not exercising before. So they weren't exercising before and they introduced them to either high intensity or moderate continuous. And the reason I say this is it doesn't have to be necessarily high intensity, but either one, so high or moderate. And for 2 weeks, they were able to reverse their prediabetes, 40% of them by just doing nothing more than just exercising. Obviously, there might be some weight loss that goes in with it, but that's really, really big. If you think about it, that is pretty crazy. And so the $1 million question is, well, do I do resistance training or do I do cardio? I don't know. First of all, let's look at endurance. There are multiple studies that looked at here. One study looked at those who did about 45 to 60 minutes of 50 to 75% of their VO2 max. So once again, VO2 max is kind of predicting the max exercise you can do. So 50 to 75%. So meaning that's a hard workout, but definitely not insane. They did this 4 times a week. They saw a decrease in their fasting plasma glucose of about 18.5 milligrams per deciliters compared to the non-exercise controls. And then we also tend to see, though, favorable improvements in insulin sensitivity and glucose control even before weight loss or fitness gains happen. So literally just exercising like your first day, you don't have any fitness gains, right? Like you haven't built up an adaptation to that. You haven't lost any weight, but you can still see improvements in insulin sensitivity and glucose before any of that happens. And that's awesome. That's why exercise in and of itself is so important. On top of that, other studies looked at indicate exercise in and of itself may lower A1C anywhere to 0.5 to 6.66%, which is not significant at all. And we'll talk about that more later. But the general studies I saw anywhere from, like I said, 0.5, maybe down to 0.3, 0.4. It really depends on the study you're looking at, but all the way up to potentially 0.66. Now looking at resistance training, when we look at resistance training, moderate resistance training, which is meaning you can do a weight of up to 15 reps at a certain weight, but not more than 15. So essentially your quote unquote max for that would be at 15, and that's moderate. Whereas vigorous is the same thing, meaning you can lift the weight up to about 6 to 8 reps. So it's just really going to be depending on your weight, right? What it is. So moderate is going to be a little lighter, vigorous is going to be heavier with lower reps. Study has shown there's been a decrease in A1C by about 0.57% after following a resistance training program, and that's pretty awesome. And I think that's pretty cool that, once again, more than half a point of A1C just on decreasing your A1C. It may actually not reduce your fasting glucose though, however, it may affect kind of like your postprandial state of exercise. So what I mean by that is they were checking people's numbers either on CGMs or just poking their fingers looking at that. And they said, hey, when they do exercise, does it decrease your fasting glucose, which is usually in the morning when you check up? And they say, not necessarily, but it did seem to affect postprandial, which means after you eat. So you might just be more sensitive multiple times throughout the day. So maybe you're providing with resistance training, you're getting muscles bigger, you're doing hypertrophy. It may provide a more muscle or a higher quality muscle, which can then be served as a glucose sink, meaning it's better at absorbing glucose or taking it up or doing the things we talked about, the insulin independent pathway of just taking up glucose. And so it's really beneficial maybe than other ways we don't even know about, in terms of maybe it's not the fasting glucose specifically, but for the rest of the day, your body's just better adapted at handling sugar. That's one way to think about it. And one meta-analysis that I looked at even mentioned that stronger the patients got, the more their A1C reduced. So like literally, which is super fascinating. Obviously, hand in hand, if you get stronger, you're probably having some benefit benefits in hypertrophy as well. But it just goes to show that in resistance training, there's so many ways to get better. Even if you're just trying to get stronger, you may have better in terms of your blood sugar control. And then what about combined? So that's resistance and aerobic. One study showed a decrease in fasting of about 36 milligrams per deciliter and a 0.59% improvement in A1C. And overall seems better than just solo exercise. I know that the initial endurance was high. That's the peak I saw, but usually it's more around like 0.5%. And then what about high intensity interval training, right? That's the one. If you go online, people say you got to do HIIT. That burns off your fat. That is the key. It does seem to be beneficial. It does seem to work, but it doesn't seem to be unique in its effects. We still get the job done, but the average drop is about 0.37%. But if you look at these here, we're spanning anywhere from 0.3 to 0.6, like pretty important. That's kind of the goal is to can we lower this A1C. And just to take a real quick step back, I realize I never talked about hemoglobin A1C. This is a measure that we commonly use for diabetes. It is measuring how much glycosylated hemoglobin you see in your bloodstream over, essentially red blood cells last about 3 months long, 90 days. And so we're measuring over those 90 days, how many of those red blood cells had glycosylated hemoglobin, meaning sugar on the hemoglobin. And we're measuring that. That's what we're measuring with A1C. It's a standard one to look at for looking diabetes. But what about exercise for those who have diabetes? Well, what interesting enough is 10 to 30% of people with diabetes in one study like that didn't actually improve their fasting glucose or their A1C after starting exercise. So we talked about that before. You're like, wait, Jordan, that doesn't make any sense. You said they can lower the A1C. This goes to show that everyone's going to be a little different. However, even these people who did improve their fasting glucose or their A1C, they did decrease the amount of medications that these patients are taking. So clearly there's some benefit. Obviously, it's not enough to say, hey, I just started exercising, I'm stopping all my meds. That's not the case. But we weren't seeing the huge decreases, but if we're decreasing the amount of meds people are taking, that is clearly a win. And those who were exercising were about 2 times more likely to have good control of their diabetes. So even if worst case scenario, you're not the best responder to exercise when it comes to your blood sugars. Let's say that's worst case scenario. It seems like the worst case scenario is that you will probably decrease the amount of medications you're taking and have better blood sugar control. That's really a win. I don't see any negative to that. And so another thing we want to talk about is, does exercise timing matter, right? Does the timing of exercise impact anything? Your body has a normal circadian rhythm, right? So we talk about morning, evening, that's how you go to sleep, all that stuff. You also have a circadian rhythm when it comes to glucose control. And typically we have worse glucose control in the afternoon. In fact, in type 2 diabetes, it actually may be better in the evening. So normally, if you don't have type 2 diabetes, you have worse evening glucose control. But if in type 2 diabetes, you actually may have better evening control and it gets worse throughout the night. Just one of the kind of tricky things. The data is kind of conflicting, but some things show that, some things show other. So it just goes to show that clearly you have irregular glucose metabolism. That's what we can take away from this. And in terms of timing, some data points show that exercise in the afternoon or evening may be beneficial for glycemic control, but we're not totally sure on that. And at the end of the day, what may happen is it may just make up for our decreased normal insulin sensitivity during the day. And so it's really not that important. The one thing though they talk about is, hey, does exercising around a mealtime seem to happen? That seems to actually be beneficial. If you exercise around mealtime, that does seem to improve insulin sensitivity, but it may be fine to also exercise before you eat and you still get those benefits after you eat. Like we talked about, it lasted a couple hours, right? So if you exercise and then eat, you probably get some of the benefit, or if you eat and then exercise, you'll get the benefit. But I think another important thing to talk about is just using exercise to break up sedentary time. Sedentary time is an independent risk factor for increased mortality. So the more sedentary you are, the more likely you are to die. That's what it is, kind of morbid, but that seems to be there. And for every 1 hour above the 8 hours of sedentary activity we normally have, you have an increased risk of diabetes by 22%. So obviously 8 hours is kind of, for a lot of office people, that's pretty standard. So the more you sit, the higher your risk for diabetes and for mortality. Not ideal. However, though, exercise can help decrease this risk. And it's not even just exercise. A simple light activity like walking, standing instead of sitting, doing calf raises, just standing there, just going up on your toes, doing half squats, really simple stuff. Even things like gardening, walking, watering the lawn, carb maintenance, all these things can decrease the risk of type 2 diabetes. So it seems that overall, all these things are beneficial for acute glycemic responses. In terms of what they measure, is it seems like your blood sugar response is better when you're more active, but we don't have as much data of, hey, this physical activity from a long-term glucose control. But what we can extrapolate back from is, hey, clearly these people who move more have decreased diabetes and improved lifespan, like a decreased mortality. And we have these short-term kind of improvements in glycemic responses. So we're kind of extrapolating, saying, hey, it probably helps long-term control. Regardless, it's good for you. Like physical activity, obviously very good, but it does seem to help with that. So the big things are, timing is kind of nebulous. Doesn't matter specifically throughout the day when you do it. Not really, doesn't look like it. Looks like if you can move around meals, that's helpful for glycemic control. And then just breaking up your day from sedentary behavior is also really important. And now we're gonna get into the big one. How does exercise compare to medications, right? That's always the biggest thing. Is, well, can I just replace my medication? So let's walk through the most common medications and how it decreases the A1C. So first of all, we're gonna talk about metformin. So this is kind of our gold standard, right? So the first line, if you have diabetes, you're gonna go on metformin. This decreases A1C by about 1%. So 1%. Now let's talk about the SGLT2 inhibitors, which is pretty much becoming our second line. This decreases A1C about 0.5 to 7.5%. And now let's talk about the GLP-1s, which are the hottest drugs on the market right now. Everyone's talking about it. These are the Wegovy, Ozempic, all that stuff. Decreases anywhere from 0.8 to 1.6%. So if we look at it though, what about exercise? Well, we talk exercise was anywhere from like the 0.3 to 6. So it kind of fits in this category here. Exercise is about as good as our second line oral medications. And I think that's pretty crazy. Is it going to bring your A1C down from 11 to normal? No, that's understandable and expected. We're going to need some more help. But it looks like if, as a physician, like I need to be prescribing, and I do, but prescribe exercise for people because it can be just as potent as medications. So once again, we should be prescribing exercise as medication because it can be as potent as medications, which is pretty crazy. And the kind of conflicting thing here is obviously some of those GLP-1s, you're going to have some weight loss, right? And so these numbers don't necessarily include weight loss in terms of exercise. So exercise is 0.3 to 0.6. If you add in weight loss on top of that, then we're going to talk about huge changes that are going to be just as big as or any bigger than any drug that we have. The GLP-1s we saw were the highest there. That probably has to do with some of the weight loss they encounter in terms of one of the side effects of the medication is to lose weight. That happens. But if we combine exercise, lifestyle habits, all that fun stuff, we can have a big decrease that's very similar to medications. And so I think it's pretty cool. And I think it's super underrated. And we need to start adding this to our stack of exercise. So we're kind of stacking exercise, lifestyle. This is big. And so nothing new here in terms of exercise is good, obviously, but I just wanted to show you how good it actually can be in that we're talking about, hey, when we are exercising, we might be as good as medication. And so overall, let's talk about my take. Exercise, it's good, right? Spoiler alert, it seems to be like a running theme here, just like, dang, Jordan, these are a waste of a podcast because I know exercise is good. Yeah, but I'm showing you how good it actually is. Exercise is clearly beneficial for diabetes or pre-diabetes. And exercise should include both aerobic and resistance training. I think both is the best. It's important because there seem to be different mechanisms in how they work. So you're going to get the biggest benefits using different modalities. On top of that, if you say, hey, where do I start? Start with the physical activity guidelines. So any more you do is better. It's seemed to be a common theme here that the more you exercise, the better things go. But start with those physical activity guidelines, 150 minutes a week of moderate aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous with resistance training twice a week. Start there. And then on top of that, it's always gonna be good. And in terms of timing, exercise quantity and frequency is, kind of nebulous there. In terms of the quantity and frequency in which you do it is much more important than perfectly timed exercise. Meaning, do I do it in the morning? Do I do it in the evening? For like glycemic control, just do it and do more of it. That's gonna be way better than freaking out about optimizing your workout routine. And also, that being said, it's probably a good idea to break up sedentary time throughout the day, whether that's getting up for a walk, moving around, doing some light exercises. All those things can be very beneficial. But that is gonna do it for today. Overall, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, please sign up for my mailing list where I'll notify you whenever we put out new content. There's no spam ever. I promise. I hate spam. That is not my favorite thing in the world. Like I said, you can go to my website and sign up. There's a link in the show notes as well. And overall, this concludes the episode. Now, get off your phone, get outside, have a great rest of the day. We'll see you next time.